Daniel, come back, Daniel. You're back.
I'm back.
Okay. Um, so hello everyone. We are the Story Sunbirds, a kid-lit collective of authors and illustrators whose mission is to cultivate a dynamic and inclusive community rooted in justice, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism. 1 year ago today, the children of Gaza held a press conference outside of El Shifa Hospital to ask for an to the war. And today we're taking part in a Children's Day of Action, a multi-organizational, multi-day effort to commemorate that day. And our action is a day-long read aloud. And we have authors present and illustrators presenting every 20 minutes until 7 p.m. tonight. And you can find the lineup in the chat. And we are also raising money for the Middle East Children's Alliance. Your donation will go to providing essential services like shelter, food, clean water, medical aid, and children's programming to Palestinian families. So please find that link in the chat as well. And when you email us a receipt of your donation, you'll be entered into a signed book giveaway from some of our presenting authors and illustrators. If you have a question for our guests, please put them in the Q&A and we will have a moment to answer them at the end. And right now, I'm gonna hand it over to Daniel Jose Elder.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, and thank you every single person who is here right now. I'm so happy y'all are here. Like I said earlier, this is how we get through this. This is how we find a way through, and there are no easy answers. But one of the many answers is that we be in community with each other, that we be there for each other authentically, and that we do our best to support one another and support the people who are experiencing the genocide however we can. And so here we are. So free Palestine. Let's begin with that. And and this is also how we get through it, is through story. We have to imagine a better world to create that better world, and that is the role of the storyteller. And we also have to organize to make that better world real. There's so many pieces. But what I came to talk about today, what I came to read to you from is a book that I wrote called Dactyl Hill Squad. And ooh, okay, wait. Yeah. This book is really special to me. And before I read from it, I want to tell you a little bit about how it happened, because I had such a good time writing it because I love dinosaurs, and we'll get to that in a second. But what happened was I was actually writing, I got a grant from an arts organization in Brooklyn to write a rock opera, as happens sometimes. And I decided to, it was called the Brooklyn Historical Society. It's over on Pierpont for folks who are in Brooklyn. It's a beautiful old building, and they have this whole archive, vast archive full of all kinds of documents from the whole history of Brooklyn. And that's where I lived at the time. And I lived in a neighborhood that's now called Crown Heights, but it used to be called Crow Hill. In fact, some of the elders around that neighborhood still call it Crow Hill. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting name. I wonder, what the history of that name is. So I decided to start to research some of that. And it turned out that that was a neighborhood that a lot of Black folks and folks of color in Manhattan during the Civil War escaped Manhattan, especially during what was called the Civil War draft riots, which a lot of folks, a lot of Black folks and Black communities were targeted. They escaped from Manhattan and came to Brooklyn, and they started autonomous communities, meaning like fully independent communities in Brooklyn. And Crow Hill was one of them. Another that is very famous is called Weeksville, where they found some of the original buildings from that time, and they created a beautiful historical society and cultural center around it that's still standing in Brooklyn. So all of that was like, wow, there was this whole history that I didn't know about. And I just started researching it, and I wrote the rock opera, and I kept researching it. And while I was researching, I learned a lot more about the draft riots and about the Civil War era. And I don't know how many of y'all are writers, but you know what happens when you're a writer? If you start filling your brain with stuff, it's gonna come out. Like it's gonna come out eventually, one way or another. And it turned out that the rock opera wasn't even enough. I had more because then I just kept going. And I latch onto something, I get excited and I'm like, ooh. And then I just kept learning. And I learned about this organization that was called the Colored Orphan Society. And it was an orphanage for young kids of color whose parents had died or were missing, and they lived there. It was in Midtown Manhattan, and it was burned down during the draft riots by racist rioters. These were coordinated riots. People talk about them like it was just this sudden explosion, but we need to understand them as targeted racist attacks, which is what really happened. Well, I was learning about this orphanage. there were it was in this really good book called In the Shadow of Slavery that I was reading about it. And it turned out that there was a group of three Cuban sisters that lived, they were just girls, just little kids that lived in this orphanage. And they were mysteriously dropped off there by a strange man and stayed for a couple months and then picked back up and taken to Cuba, back to Cuba. And I'm Cuban. So the second that I saw that, I was like, what? Wait a minute, wait a minute. It's like this moment. Like I knew there were Cubans in New York in the 1860s. That wasn't, or in the 1830s and 40s and 50s and 60s too. That wasn't like a shock, but it was because I hadn't thought about it because we never hear about Cubans being there. Cubans are everywhere all the time, first of all. But like I said, we don't talk about that. Like it just wasn't on my radar. And it totally shocked me. And you have that moment where you're like, wow, we were there. We were there too on some level. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it was just this like little paragraph, right? But it made me so excited and curious. But that was it. There was no more information to find out. Like they were lost to history. Basically, they were just whisked back up. And I mean, second of all, doesn't it already just sound like a children's book? Like it's some like a group of sisters and they're dropped off mysteriously and then they're whisked away again into the night and nobody knows what happened to them. And as a fantasy writer, that's my job, right? And for fantasy writers, our work begins where the historical record ends, because that all that's left to us then is imagination. So I started imagining. It wasn't even on purpose. I couldn't stop myself. I just kept thinking about it. And I imagined like what would have happened or what might have happened if they actually weren't taken back to Cuba, but instead they escaped and they moved through the streets of New York City and had adventures, and it was Civil War era and they had to survive the Civil War draft riots, and all these things started happening to them. And you could tell like I was already just even just in asking the question, the story started to unravel. And then I was like, a question that I think all of us ask at one time or another when we're thinking through story, I was like, what would happen if they could ride pterodactyls? And then I was like, oh, this is gonna be good. I just immediately knew like this was gonna be something really fun because I was like, wow, the Civil War and Cuban kids in an orphanage and dinosaurs. It just seems so obvious. Like, how come no one else has ever put those pieces together yet? So I start, and it's like the book, like I said, it just almost like rolled out. It's a trilogy. It almost just rolled right out of me once I put those two things in the same place. And I'll tell you something, part of my logic, it wasn't a lot of logic involved, but one little bit of logic that was there was that I was like, if I put dinosaurs in this book, then no one is going to check me on the historical information, whether it's right or wrong. I love history and I think we should teach it accurately, but in a fantasy novel, you have a little bit of room to change things up and all that. And I wanted to sort of establish that I was more interested in telling this really great story than in being like, here's fact for fact what happened in that era. So my thinking was, all right, I'll put some dinosaurs in. And then if someone's like, hey, the Battle of Gettysburg actually happened a month earlier than that, I can be like, well, were there pterodactyls at the Battle of Gettysburg? And then that could be the whole argument, right? So I was thinking that, but I played myself because, as I already said, I get really fascinated with history. And so I kept reading more and more, and I wanted to know more and more and more and more about the Civil War and about that era and about everything that happened, and especially about the little battles and the little stories that we didn't hear that much about, because everybody hears about the Gettysburg and everybody hears about certain aspects of it and knows about Abe Lincoln and blah blah blah, but there's so much more. And especially there are so many stories of people of color surviving and thriving and fighting for their freedom and for each other's freedom that we don't hear about. Like we know about the Underground Railroad, but we don't know about all the organizing work that it took to make that happen and all the different stops along the way, and the local work in Brooklyn and in Manhattan that folks were doing to get people free in lots of different ways. And I thought that was so fascinating. And I thought it was so sad that racist history just erases all of that and acts like it was just this very simple, like, oh, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, when the enslaved people. We know it was much more complicated than that. And so many people freed each other and freed themselves, or they got free. And like, we know about Harriet Tubman, but so many other people too would help each other get free. And so those were stories that I wanted to lift up, and I learned so many amazing things along the way. And I ended up writing this book. So I'm gonna read from the book. What the main character is a girl named Magdalise Roca, and she is when we meet her, she's in the Colored Orphans Asylum, but it quickly gets burned down in the race riots, and her friends have to escape, and they make it to Brooklyn. And the thing about Magdalise is that she loves dinosaurs so, so much. But because she lives in the orphanage, she's barely had any opportunity to be around them. All she wants to do is ride dinosaurs. But what she realizes very early on in the book is that not only does she love dinosaurs, but if she concentrates and focuses hard enough, the dinosaurs can understand what she's thinking and they react to it and respond to it. So she can actually tell dinosaurs what to do with her mind, which comes in really handy when you're a kid trying to escape a bunch of racists in New York City and they have guns and you don't, and you got to get away with your friends. So she's starting to figure out how to make this power work. When they arrive in Brooklyn, she's with her friends Two Step and Mapper. Mapper's obviously really good at geography. Two Steps is always dancing. And Sabine is another one of her little friends. So they get to Brooklyn and they immediately get jobs as chimney sweeps, which a lot of young people did at the time because they were small. And it's a really dangerous and horrible job and really bad for your lungs. But, these were difficult days for a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. But the good thing is they didn't have to jump from roof to roof because they had pterodactyls. And in this world, instead of Crow Hill, go, little Sabine yelled. Magdalise, Two Step, and Mapper, now all in their street clothes, charged across the rooftop, full speed. Up ahead, a squad of dactyls huddled at the edge of the building, sunning themselves and chattering in shrill squawks. This seems like the worst idea in the world, Two Step pointed out, already out of breath. Maybe it is, Magdalise said, but she couldn't keep the smile from breaking out across her face. But it's the only way to get across. Maybe getting across is overrated, Mapper suggested from a little behind them. Magdalise rolled her eyes. We've already swept all the chimneys on this block. This is going to sound ridiculous, Two Step said, but we could always, climb down the stairs like normal people and then walk across the street to the next block. And waste all that precious time, Magdalise scoffed. Please. Anyway, too late. They came up fast on the dactyl squad, just like Bernice had told them to. Dactyls are not the brightest taros, she'd said while they finished the last of their sweet oats. And some of those micro and mini ones are pretty weak, all told, but they're social. That means that to survive, they travel in a group. A group of dactyls is called a squad. That's why you see them all grouped up on those building tops like that. You just got to find a squad, then pick one, get a good running start, and surprise the taro poop out of it. All 5 pairs of eyes went wide. Not literally, of course, Bernice added with a chuckle, and then off you go. On either side of Magdalise, Mapper and Two Step were shaking their heads in horror. Just stay within the boundary of lines of Dactyl Hill, please, and mind you don't go near that silo on the edge of town, or the penitentiary, for heaven's sake, and keep track of the chimneys you sweep so I can charge them for it when you're done. Now, finish your breakfast, kids. You have a long day ahead of you, and when the summer's over, we'll see about getting you enrolled in the African Free School they opened up over in Weeksville. Now they were bearing down on the squad, and the dactyl Magdalise had picked was flapping its wings like it might be about to take off. Magdalise narrowed her eyes and ran harder, slamming into the dactyl's back and wrapping her arms around its neck like Bernice had said to do. An explosion of caws and shrieks erupted around her as 24 wings started flapping at the same time. She felt herself plummeting and heard the dactyl screech. Fly, she thought. But even as she did, the buildings around them fell away, and she and the dactyl soared toward the sky. She glanced back, saw Two-Step on top of another dactyl, screaming for dear life. Mapper stood on the roof, surrounded by flapping wings, shaking his head. Sabine was a few feet behind them, watching in awe. The morning sun threw their shadows long across the rooftops. And then all of Brooklyn stretched beneath Magdalise, the giant penitentiary at the top of the hill, the neighborhoods rising and falling amidst the wilderness, the sun-soaked bay. She released a yell of pure joy, felt the summer wind kiss her face and play with her hair. And this dactyl, this strange and beautiful creature with its wrinkled gray-brown hide, barrel chest, and slender neck, she just wanted to hug it. Bernice had told them to use the crest extending from the back of the dactyl's head to nudge them in one direction or the other. But this one had already responded to her thoughts, just like the Brachiosaurus had, and Magdalise had no intention of yanking its head around if she didn't have to. Up, she thought. And the reply in her mind sounded something like fubba 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 fubba. It was real. This connection, she wasn't making it up. Maybe she'd always had it, but had never gotten a chance to just let it manifest. It's not like she'd been able to spend much time with the dinos up until now. And when she did, she certainly didn't try to communicate with them. Or maybe this was a new skill that had developed somehow. Either way, it was the greatest gift she could imagine, and she was absolutely sure no one would believe her if she tried to explain it. They'd probably lock her up in a whole other kind of asylum. No, the world wasn't ready for Magdalese's special abilities. It would be her secret with the dinos. Sang the dactyl. They soared even higher and then careened in a wide circle toward the shipyards at Red Hook, filled with boats of all kinds and the long necks of sauropods offloading crates, and then they swung back around toward Dactyl Hill. That tree-lined neighborhood at the top of the smaller slope must be the Crest, Magdalise thought, where all the affluent Brooklynites were said to live, promenading along the streets astride their graceful duckbills. An elegant dome punctuated the cluster of official-looking buildings in downtown Brooklyn, and there was the wide stretch of Flatbush Avenue that ran from the ferry terminal up to the top of Dactyl Hill. Then, suddenly, they were sinking again, and the building tops rushed up toward Magdalise as the two plaits Sabine had braided her hair into that morning flapped behind her in the brushing wind. Fubba, 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 foo! Came the strange muttering in her mind. The dactyl was diving. Don't stay on them long, Bernice had offered as a final warning. Most of the untrained ones are not that strong and can't hold your weight for much time. Just get to the next rooftop and let them free. One thing there'll always be more of on Dactyl Hill is dactyls. Right. In the wonder of seeing the whole world from above for the first time, Magdalise had forgotten that part. The rooftops got bigger and bigger, and Magdalise was pretty sure she was about to get dashed across them and splattered to a million pieces when the dactyl swooped low over the chimneys at the last second, whoosh, and then came in doop, doop, for a bumpy landing, stopping right at the building edge. Magdalise hopped off and teetered back and forth for a few seconds, whoop, trying to remember what gravity felt like. Thank you, she stuttered. The dactyl squawked twice in what might have been a snicker, and then took off to join its squad. Magdalise scanned the rooftops for her own squad. She caught sight of Two-Step still screaming his head off on a dactyl back not too far away. Over here, Magdalise called, laughing. Two-Step! He stopped screaming long enough to see her, then veered his tarot toward the rooftop where she stood waving. They landed in a tangled crash, and then Two-Step popped up with a huge smile on his face. That was amazing!
Daniel. All right.
That
Thank you
was
so
awesome,
much.
Daniel.
Thank you.
That
Thank you.
was so fun.
Appreciate y'all.
So if anyone has questions for Daniel, please drop them in the Q&A box. We have a quick minute. And don't forget, we're raising money for the Middle East Children Alliance. So the link is in the box as well. And Daniel, I just love the way you sort of said, oh, we got something from Eric. This was the best. Love hearing about your world building process. Yeah, from Eric Smith.
Thank you, Eric.
And Rachel Cruz says, I love Dactyl Hill Squad.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, everybody. So happy to be here.
Yeah, I love the way you could always say, oh, it's about dinosaurs, though. I don't know.
It's
Because
about dinosaurs.
actually,
What do you want me to do?
historically, that was great.
It's so historically accurate, though. It's not even funny. Like, it's out of control how it ended up being that way. Like I said, played myself.
That was awesome. Thank you so much,
All
Daniel,
right. Thanks,
for
everybody.
joining us
Have a
today.
wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you so much. Okay, so